Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Vintage Sci-Fi, where I take stories from way back when and read them to you. These are public domain stories, so you can head over and download them if you want. If you have any other short stories in mind that are public domain, just pop them into the comments down below and I'll have a look and possibly even narrate them for you. Anyways, let's head on to the story. It's called A Fishing Trip on the Planet Mars, written by F.H. Sidney. Written in the year 1919. It was during my summer vacation one year that I enjoyed a delightful fishing trip on the planet Mars. I took my fishing rod and a lunch one fine morning and started for a stream where I expected to catch some big bass. Although I fished steadily till noon, I didn't even feel the nibble. By this time, I felt hungry and sat down under a tree to eat my lunch. Just as I finished my lunch, I noticed a strange-looking flower about 10 feet away from where I was sitting, and I walked over to examine it. As I reached the spot, the flower suddenly disappeared, and I felt myself being drawn into space. I yelled for help. There wasn't a soul in sight, and in a few seconds, I was up among the clouds and had lost all view of Earth. Where will I land? I kept asking myself. Suppose I should begin to drop. Flashed across my mind. Just then I noticed a speck in the sky above me. I was headed right for it. The speck grew larger, and violently. It assumed enormous proportions, and I saw a great world. I sailed above it, and then began to slowly descend into what appeared to be a laboratory on the top of a high building. Just as I touched the floor of the laboratory, a man with a familiar-looking face stepped out from behind the enormous telescope and cried, "Hello, stranger. Welcome to the planet Mars." "John Hopkins," I cried. "The man that disappeared from our town 5 years ago." "The same," he answered, "and I've been here ever since. I wouldn't go back under any circumstances." "How did you get up here?" I asked. "The same way you did," he replied. "The Martians were hungry for news from Mother Earth. They had tried for years to establish communications between the planets with no success. Finally, Astro, the Martian Edison, invented that machine that you see there. That is a powerful telescope and a magnet combined. By training this telescope onto the Earth, we can plainly discern people and objects on the Earth, and in case we feel we need any of you up here, we can draw you up in a few moments and drop you back by the same means without injuring you in the least. I could have gone back, but I didn't want to. There was no family ties on the Earth to hold me. Consequently, I preferred to stay. But today I felt hungry for news from old Mother Earth and asked Astral to draw someone up. He located you fishing by a creek. And as there is no one in sight down there to witness the feat and frighten them to death, I quickly drew you up. We'll send you back in a few days, and you can simply say that you were lost in the woods, for no one will believe your story. The flower that attracted your attention was the reflection of the lens of the telescope. What is the news?" Here's a copy of the morning's paper." I handed it to him. "Bully!" he exclaimed. "I'll read that tonight. Come, let me introduce you to Astral and show you the wonderful machine. Then we'll go to my house, and tomorrow we'll go fishing in the Martian canals." Hopkins introduced me to Astral, who explained the wonderful machine to me. And then we stepped aboard a tiny runabout airplane and flew to his home in the country, on the bank of a beautiful clear water canal. "How was the Martian speaking English?" I asked. "I introduced the language which was adopted as the national language of the planet. I have just completed 2 terms as president of the planet Mars, and now a woman sits in the president's chair. Equal suffrage prevails here, and it has proved a complete success. Here we are home," and he dropped to a hangar on the roof of his residence. We then descended into the living room, where he introduced me to his handsome wife and 2 beautiful daughters. We spent a very pleasant evening together. Hopkins read bits of interesting news from the paper I had given him to his family, and the next day he arranged to have the contents of the whole paper published in all Martian dailies. The next day, at noon, Hopkins and myself attended a lunch given in my honor by the press club. This lunch was what we would call a banquet on Mother Earth. There were enormous trout, baked, tiny deer and buffalo, barbecued, broiled game, birds of all kinds, the most delicious fruits, and the table was decorated with flowers. "We use electricity for everything," explained Hopkins. "Heat, cooking, power, fertilizer for the soil, medicine, and even as ammunition for our radio-sporting rifles. All power is transmitted by the wireless system. Tomorrow, you will have an opportunity to shoot some of these big trout with a radio gun. Our fish are large, but the game animals are small. This was brought about by a scientific system of breeding. There are no reptiles, beasts of prey, or vermin on this planet. We exterminated them long ago." After lunch, we took a trip over the planet in a big passenger airship, returning in time for dinner. I retired early that night in order to be rested for the fishing trip next day. The most beautiful song I ever heard awakened me the next morning, and looking out of the window, I saw the songster. It was a gorgeously colored bird, somewhat resembling the scarlet tanager. I dressed and hurried down to the breakfast, where the family were waiting for me. As soon as we had finished breakfast, Hopkins and I stepped aboard the runabout and flew to his boathouse on the canal system. The big boathouse was full of all kinds and sizes of watercraft, everything from canoe to a good-sized yacht. Hopkins ran out a motor canoe, and taking 2 radio rifles from a locker, we stepped aboard, started the engine, and ran out into the main canal. "I'll explain the workings of the rifle to you, and then you can try your luck. Of course, you'll miss it first. But as soon as you get used to shooting at the fast-moving fish in the water, you'll score a kill every time. It's the electric current that kills them, and they come to the top as soon as they are killed. We'll only kill what we can use. That is a custom rigidly followed by the Martian sportsmen. There are no game hogs amongst us." "Gee whiz, what a big fellow!" I cried as a huge fish swam slowly along the sandy bottom of the canal. "That is a Martian sucker. Try the gun on him," answered Hopkins. I tried 3 times and missed every time. Finally, the fish swam into one of the lateral canals and got away. "See that big lobster down there on the bottom there? Don't shoot. Reserve your marksmanship for bigger game. Wouldn't that fellow create a sensation of an exhibition in the show window of some of the lobster palaces on Broadway? Our Martian lobsters are mighty good eating." "Is the water in the canal system as clear and pure as this? And is the sandy bottom everywhere?" I asked. "Yes," replied Hopkins. "Now we're coming to game country, and perhaps we'll catch a glimpse of the herds of deer and buffalo feeding along the canal." We are now sailing through the prairie country, and in the distance I saw what I took to be a moving herd. "Take these field glasses and look at them," said Hopkins. Sure enough, they were a herd of tiny bison, and how odd they looked in their shaggy coats and with the hump on their shoulders. The herd galloped off as the canoe approached. "Perhaps you can pick one off with your rifle, but what's the use shooting one when you don't need the meat? Pretty soon I think we'll run across some deer or moose. Our little dwarf moose will look odd to you." Sure enough, we ran into both a herd of moose and a herd of deer. We got quite close to them before they noticed us, and I was able to get a good look at them with the naked eye before they ran off. "We're now in the trout section of the canal. Watch sharp," said Hopkins. Just then an enormous brook trout crossed our bows, and I made a clean miss. "I'll never get used to this method of fishing, Hopkins." "Don't get discouraged. Keep trying." Just then another big beauty came along, and taking careful aim, I fired, and the big fish turned belly up and came to the top of the water. I picked him up, delighted. "He'll weigh 20 pounds, I created. "All of that," replied Hopkins, as he took a pair of scales from the canoe locker. "Just 28 pounds. I think that's enough fish for today. We'll have him baked for dinner. Now for a cruise through the wood country, where we'll probably see some Martian bird life." We entered a section that was thickly wooded on both sides. There were birds everywhere, and the air was full of melody. The Martian birds sang even sweeter than those in Mother Earth. "See that flock of passenger pigeons?" cried Hopkins. "That's something that game hogs killed off in the Mother Earth long ago." A few moments later, we ran into a school of leaping salmon, and how beautiful the silvery bodies looked as they glistened in the sunlight. "Here comes a flock of partridges. Pick one off." I aimed and fired at one of the leaders, and the large, handsome bird dropped into the canal. We picked it up and weighed it, and I was very much surprised to find that its weight was 15 pounds. We ran out of forest, and the canal broadened into a huge lake. Here we ran into schools of smelts, mackerel, and all sorts of edible fish. "We'll cruise down as far as the saltwater, where I will show you some fine clam and oyster beds. Then we'll head for home. For tomorrow, I want to start you back towards Mother Earth, before your family will have given you up altogether. You've been gone 2 days now. That's long enough to be lost in the wilderness of New York suburbs. See the shellfish on the bottom there? They thrive on the sandy bottom and are larger and sweeter than the shellfish that you've been accustomed to. I'll scoop up a few for our dinner tonight." And he drew a collapsible scoop from the canoe locker, and scooped up enough clams and oysters for our evening meal. "Now we'll speed for home," said Hopkins. The little craft speedometer registered 65 miles an hour. We got through the water at a terrific rate, and in a very short time we reached the boathouse, where we boarded the runabout airship and flew to Hopkins's home. Our dinner that night consisted of baked trout, grilled oysters, steamed clams, and clam bouillon, and how good everything tasted. I spent a very pleasant evening with the family and retired early. By 6 o'clock the next morning I was up and dressed, and after a splendid breakfast I bade Mrs. Hopkins and her daughters goodbye, and Mr. Hopkins and I flew to the laboratory, where Astral was waiting for us. How I hated to leave, and I know that Hopkins was sorry to see me go. "Never mind, old man," he said. "You arranged to be at the same place fishing at the same time next year, and we'll draw you up, and we can enjoy another fishing trip on Mars together." "Booty!" I cried. "It's settled then, and I'll be with you next year at this time." I shook hands with Hopkins and Astral, then stood in front of the machine as directed by its inventor. I felt myself lifted gently in the air and gradually rose above the planet. As soon as I was completely clear of Mars, I began dropping into space, and in a few moments my feet touched old Mother Earth again. I awoke with a start. "Great guns! I've slept the whole afternoon away, and nary a fish have I caught, and the sun is about ready to set. Guess I better start for home. That was certainly the finest dream I've ever had. It's too beautiful to tell anyone. Guess I'll keep it to myself for a while anyway." Then I gathered up my belongings and hiked towards home, just as the sun dipped down behind the bend in the river. "That coloring on the water reminds me of the sunset I saw on Mars," I whispered to myself. End of story.